but what's worked best for me is before I go to sleep every single night, I get on my knees, the side of the bed, like a little kid in a movie, right? But for me, this is what works. And I pray, and I pray for other people first. Then I spend a little bit of time listening, a couple of minutes just listening, seeing what comes up. Then I spend a little bit of time praying for things that I'm working on, challenges. I'm mostly praying for strength to deal with those challenges and for energy to direct my body and my soul toward goodness in the world. And then occasionally I'll focus on something that I might be especially challenged with or especially grateful for in that time. And then I say my thanks and I go to sleep.
Very cool.
And if I wake up in the middle of the night, I usually do the same. If I'm having trouble getting back to sleep. And I pray before every podcast that I record. And I just pray for being able to be in the right space to give the most amount of useful knowledge and goodness that I possibly can. And some people might say, well, these are just intentions, but let's just say that the prayer is formalized enough, and I've spent enough time just looking at and talking to people who really understand Scripture to understand that, okay, that's not my expertise. I wasn't trained in that, but it's so very clear, right, to me, and we can talk about how this became more and more clear, that the brain has a sort of I don't want to say good and evil, but it has a kind of organization of dark and light. Mm-hmm. It's not what we want to do versus what we're expected to do. That's a very cynical view of things. I just think that the brain is organized into impulses and intention, and intention controls impulses, and then they work together toward goodness. What is goodness? Goodness are the things that evolve our species in the right direction, right? Towards more prosperity, towards less destruction, toward less evil in others, because sometimes it exists there. And so whether or not that's through science or through the military or through social work or through family and raising kids and partnership, it shows up in different forms. But prayer to me is where you get back to the fundamentals. Like there are times in prayer where I really feel as if, okay, this is a brain thing, and clearly somebody understood at some point this was a brain thing. But there are two views in the world, in my opinion. There might be a third I'm not aware of. I'm sure someone will put it in the comments. You either believe that this whole God-devil thing exists in the brain and that it's a human creation, or you believe it comes from outside the brain. Mm-hmm. Well, I believe it comes from outside the brain. And I know some scientists will be like, and people will be like, how can you be a scientist and say that? Well, I'm certainly not the only scientist who's ever said that. People who really understand and think about consciousness at a deep level are still pondering whether or not consciousness comes from within the brain or it's received by the brain in some way. And so to me, my training is in science, and I know a fair amount about health as well, but it's so very clear that this notion of higher power, that there are forces outside of us that powerfully determine how we behave. Powerfully. There's just no question. Yeah. And it squares beautifully with everything we know about science, including biology and psychology. So the two are not mutually exclusive. So, but to be more direct, I get on my knees and I thank God for all the gifts. I ask for help where I need help. I pray for people that I think might need help. And I spend an immense amount of time in gratitude. And Eddie has me reading the Bible, and there's just so much wisdom in there. And if any of this makes people kind of uncomfortable, what I'll tell you is that any brave person should be able to look at something, know that you'll hold on to yourself enough that it shouldn't be scary. There's always learning in these things. I think people are afraid they're like going to get sucked into some vortex of like where they're going to lose themselves, but it's the opposite. What I've found for me is that when you start to accept this whole concept, that you find yourself, you don't lose yourself.
Yeah, it's brought a lot of benefits to me, and we'll dig more into that in the main podcast. But I just want to say thank you for opening up about that, and it's very cool that you're doing that.
Thanks. Well, and I'm a newbie. Like, I want to be clear. I'm not an expert in religion by any stretch or or prayer as a practice, but I've been very consistent about it. I've really felt the benefits of it. And it's if I had to pick one thing I couldn't do without, it's that.
That's awesome, man. That's great to hear. All right, let's get on with